Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're going to be doing a really fascinating deep dive today into how to raise kids who are not just, capable and successful, but truly thrive, like happy, resilient, all that good stuff. And you guys sent in some amazing sources for this one, really digging into the pressures kids face today and some really different ways of thinking about parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. Going through everything you said, the thing that really jumped out at me is this tension. We've got this societal pressure for achievement, which a lot of parents feel, right? Versus this need to really nurture a child's well-being, their own
Right.
drive to learn and grow, not just for the grades, but for life.
Yeah, totally. And, those societal pressures are so real. I mean, just reading through these sources, it's like this sense of urgency, like it's Yale or McDonald's, as one article put it. This kind of leads to what they call manic driving, this idea that you have to constantly push, overschedule your kid, kind of this more is better
Mm.
mentality. And a key takeaway here is that this approach, this all or nothing view of success, it's actually not only inaccurate, but it can be harmful to kids.
Exactly. It's really challenging the sources call them false assumption 2 and false assumption 3, right? That intense pressure, like that's the only path, and pushing harder automatically equals a more successful adult.
Mm.
And the sources really push back on this more is better thing. I remember one example talking about how counterproductive it is to try and, teach ninth grade math to a sixth grader who's struggling. It's like, if they're not ahead, they're behind.
Right, right. Like this fear of falling behind if they're not always ahead. But, these sources are saying this can actually backfire big time. It creates this chronic stress. And they actually compare it to trying to grow a plant in a pot that's way too small. It weakens the plant in the long run.
Yeah, it makes sense. And, looking at the bigger picture, the sources highlight some pretty alarming statistics. We're seeing rises in, stress-related illnesses, anxiety, eating disorders, depression, even things like self-harm. Madeline Levine's work has mentioned specifically, how even kids in affluent areas are at risk.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff. Like that Silicon Valley high school survey. I mean, 80% reporting moderate to severe anxiety, 54% moderate to severe depression. That's not just a few kids, it's like a widespread thing.
Right.
And then, that depression is the number one cause of disability worldwide.
Yeah.
That really puts things into perspective.
And it makes you wonder, what's behind all this? The sources point to one big factor: our sense of control, how we experience stress. There's this fascinating study about rats where one rat has a wheel it can run on to stop an electric shock. And even when the wheel is disconnected, just having it there reduces the rat's stress. So it's not just about having control, it's about feeling like we have agency, you know, even if it's an illusion.
Oh, that's so interesting. The perception of control. I remember they had that human example too, right? Where people could press a button to stop a noise, even if the button didn't work. But just being able to try, it seemed to help.
And this leads to the idea that a low sense of control might actually be the most stressful thing. Kara's story really brought this home, how her anxiety was really bad when she felt like all her choices were being made for her. And just, having those little opportunities for choice, that really helped her feel more in control.
It makes you think about, how often as adults, even with the best intentions, we might be taking away kids' sense of control. Micromanaging homework, dictating activities, even trying to steer their friendships. Like, we're telling them they can't handle their own lives.
Right, right. And the sources emphasize this isn't just anecdotal. Over 60 years of research show that this feeling of control is linked to a lot of good things. Better physical health, less substance abuse, living longer, lower stress, higher well-being, internal motivation, and better performance at school and work. It's clear, kids are wired for this.
But the goal isn't to, remove every challenge or struggle, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they talk about the stress sweet spot, this idea of building resilience. It's not about a totally risk-free environment.
No, definitely not. You can't engineer a stress-free life, and trying to actually makes anxiety worse, believe it or not.
Yeah.
What's really important is to help kids develop that tolerance, that resilience. When they feel some control during tough times, it helps them handle stress better in the future. Like it's almost like an immunization, the sources say.
And this is where it gets really cool how stress affects the brain. The prefrontal cortex, kind of the CEO of the brain, planning, decision-making, regulating emotions. It needs this just right balance of dopamine and norepinephrine. Mild stress can sharpen focus, but too much or even lack of sleep, it floods the brain, makes learning and clear thinking really hard.
It's fascinating.
Yep.
And it interacts with the amygdala, the part of the brain that handles the stress response, the lion fighter, Chronic stress can make the amygdala bigger, which makes you more prone to negative emotions,
Yeah.
fear, anxiety, anger.
So, okay, this is all super interesting, but what does it mean for parents? Like, what are some things we can do to foster autonomy and that sense of control? The sources have some pretty concrete ideas.
They do.
Yeah.
One simple thing. Make a list of what your child already controls, and then brainstorm areas where you could give them more. Even just asking them directly, what would you like to be in charge of? That could be so revealing.
And it's not just big decisions, it's the way we talk to them every day, offering choices instead of just giving orders. That small shift can make a big difference. And they also talk about, talking about stress, sharing our own experiences, especially around those common triggers like new situations, unpredictability, feeling criticized, and of course, lack of control. Name it to tame it, as they say.
Yes, and that parent as consultant model, it's a real shift. Instead of constantly hovering, directing, fixing things for them, it's more about offering guidance, support, but ultimately putting the responsibility back on the kid, like Jonah's story. When parents work harder than their kids, it actually makes the kid weaker.
That's such a great point. The more we try to control, the less they're invested. And that moment when parents finally say, okay, you're on your own, that's when the kid often has to step up. The sources are clear. Trying to make kids do things through force or threats, not good long term. Fear is a terrible motivator.
What's interesting is Jonah's parents had success when they shifted. They offered help, but they were firm. We're not going to make you do it. And that it's your call. Philosophy, not deciding things kids can decide themselves. That's key. Set boundaries, but give them space within those boundaries. Work together to solve problems. That builds trust and respect.
And this isn't just about good parenting, right? It's about the brain. Why does fostering autonomy work so well?
Right, because when kids make their own decisions, even small ones, and deal with the results, their brains are learning how to make those tough choices. That builds resilience and protects them from feeling helpless later on. And that internal motivation that comes from autonomy, that's powerful. And as they face those challenges, succeed, learn to manage stress, their prefrontal cortex literally gets better at regulating the amygdala.
It's like giving their brains a workout, right? And the sources also talk about how important the teenage years are for brain development.
Yes, absolutely. The adolescent brain is going through so much growth, but that prefrontal cortex, for judgment and all that, it's not fully developed until around 25. Emotional control even later, like into the early 30s. And too much stress during this time can actually hinder that development. So it makes sense that teenagers have bigger reactions to stress and it takes longer to recover.
That's why shifting our focus away from just grades, really supporting their well-being and growth, that's so important. Like Jared's story, remember, he was the Teflon kid. Everything seemed easy, but then he got depressed in high school from the pressure and lack of sleep. And that fear, like some kid in Idaho was going to steal his spot at Duke, it's crazy the mindset that can take over.
The sources warn against parents taking over too much, even with those high stakes in high school. It tells your kid, we don't trust you to handle this. And they can actually struggle more in college when they're suddenly on their own. Remember that story? The mother who regretted all the fights about homework? She wished she just enjoyed those last years with her son. It's powerful. We want to raise thoughtful, self-disciplined kids, not just well-disciplined ones.
Okay, so how do we cultivate that internal motivation? They talk about how the brain can change, that our focus shapes those neural pathways.
Right. And they talk about this concept of flow. It's that state of being totally engaged in something challenging but enjoyable. Dopamine goes up, which makes you want to keep doing it. Finding that just right balance is key. Not too easy, not too hard.
And what about the kid who just doesn't seem motivated at all? The saboteur, they called them.
Ah, yes. Well, the sources say to focus on helping them connect what they're doing, even small things, to their bigger goals. And crucially, it's about them finding their own reasons. Shifting from, I have to do this, to, I want to do this. Visualizing goals, writing them down, that helps too. Remember Sebastian's story? He struggled in traditional school, but then he found fire science and really thrived. It's about exploring, finding that spark.
And the kids who are, kind of downbeat, the Eeyores, how do you help them?
Encourage service activities, limit that passive entertainment, too much scrolling and expose them to new things. But mostly, it's about expressing confidence that they will find their passions. You can't force passion. It has to come from them. And just asking, what do you want, can be so powerful.
Okay, let's talk about this elite college equals success myth. The sources really take this on.
They do. I mean, that anecdote about the AP English teacher who was worried, her student think it's Yale or McDonald's. And the research they cite is pretty compelling. The Dale and Kruger study, for example, it showed that for kids with similar SAT scores, going to a super selective college didn't make them earn more money later. And the Gallup and Purdue study found that it's the experience that matters. Having professors who care, hands-on learning, activities, those predict well-being and career success, not just the name of the school. And even a Pew Research Center study showed that public and private college grads have similar life satisfaction.
It makes you wonder why this myth is so strong, you know?
Yeah.
Bill's experience, he tried to share this research with his elementary school kids, and his own daughter in high school didn't believe it. That's how deeply ingrained this idea is.
It is. And that brings us to another important thing: downtime and sleep. The sources talk about radical downtime. And it's not just relaxing with a book, it's really doing nothing, no screens, nothing purposeful.
Wow, that sounds hard in our always-on world. But they say it's crucial for the brain to process everything, to make sense of it all. It's the default mode network at work. Even daydreaming, which we often think of as, wasting time, actually has benefits for analysis, problem solving, creativity.
And then there's mindfulness. So many forms these days, from guided meditation to mindful movement. There are apps like Headspace and MindYeti and books for younger kids too. But the most radical downtime, the most important, is sleep.
Which, let's be honest, can be a huge struggle. They talk about how average sleep hours have gone way down, because of electric light technology. And those signs, that daytime tiredness, needing caffeine, needing an alarm to wake up, that's so common.
Kelly's story, trying to juggle varsity sports and AP classes, that's so relatable. The sources talk about the teen sleep phase shift, how their biology makes it harder to fall asleep early. They suggest some experiments to help teens understand their own sleep needs, and even, offering incentives for earlier bedtimes, not as a control thing, but because it's good for them. Even things like, making driving privileges contingent on getting enough sleep.
Because it's not just about being tired, right? Sleep is connected to learning, memory. They mention the Yerkes-Dodson law, how stress affects learning, and even how boys and girls can have different stress responses.
And that brings us to homework and the whole pressure around schoolwork. The sources point out how much homework has increased even in elementary school, even though there's not much evidence that helps that much at that age. And some high schoolers are giving way too much, and the kids don't even think it's useful.
It is that more is better thinking again, right? And they say all this homework can actually hurt learning, create family tension, and take away that sense of autonomy and motivation. That motto, inspire but don't require, that's so good. And the idea of voluntary, ungraded homework where kids have some choice, that seems much better for encouraging real learning.
What's interesting is how this connects to brain development. Learning gets easier as the brain matures. Pushing things too early, like making little kids practice writing too much, it can backfire. And pushing advanced material too early, algebra in 8th grade, that's had negative consequences. The sources recommend choosing schools that understand development and taking a long view. It doesn't matter if a kid learns to read at 5 or 7, for example.
And while testing can be useful for feedback, and getting comfortable with tests, they do point out the problems with too much emphasis on standardized tests. And they stress the importance of things outside academics for motivation and well-roundedness.
Now, we can't talk about raising kids today without talking about technology. The sources talk about how tech has changed kids' brains. They have a lower tolerance for boredom, but their stress response hasn't changed.
That's kind of scary, actually. And they talk about the downsides, like social media taking control away through, needing validation from peers, constantly comparing themselves, and how video games are designed to be addictive, especially for teens whose self-control is still developing.
The advice they give is practical. Model good habits ourselves, try to understand what's normal among their peers, set rules together, and be open to changing them if the kids have good reasons. And what those tech execs who send their kids to Waldorf schools say, that's interesting. Tech skills are easy to learn later. And they talk about how multitasking is actually inefficient. More errors, slower work, less deep thought, more cortisol.
So it's not about banning tech, but teaching them to use it well, being open about what they see online, and setting those boundaries.
Right. And then helping them understand and manage their emotions. Remember Ben's story, perfectionism, low frustration tolerance.
Yep.
But explaining the science behind it, that it was his primitive brain acting up, it helped him gain control.
That reframing is so powerful, takes the blame away. The sources talk about Plan B thinking, coming up with other strategies so you're less anxious and more adaptable.
And reframing the whole problem, changing how you think about it. Remember that families choose your point of view game. our perspective really changes everything. And language, too, shifting from I have to I want to. And building in that mental contrast and, thinking about obstacles when you set goals. And of course, modeling self-compassion and positive self-talk ourselves.
Every kid is different. And they talk about how to adjust for kids with different needs like autism and ADHD.
It's about giving them the structure they need, but not in a way that feels controlling. Like with homework for kids with learning disabilities. Advocate for less work, offer help but don't force it, and remind them that many people with learning differences are late bloomers. And talking about test results, always start with strengths, then frame challenges in a way that makes sense to them so they're more open to getting help. And the sources talk about how sometimes parents are more upset about missed work than the kid. We have to help them take ownership. They suggest some strategies. And for ADHD, exercise, meditation, and collaborative problem solving can help. And for autism, experts agree that experiencing autonomy is key for motivation and independence.
Sometimes what looks like lack of motivation is actually something else going on,
Right. Like those stories of students who were labeled unmotivated, but they actually had learning differences, like slow processing speed or trouble reading. And stress outside of school can affect their performance too, like a fight before a test or worrying about stereotypes.
Test anxiety is a big one. The sources talk about how tests, while they have their place, can feel like a threat, to a kid's ego. And they remind us that a test score doesn't tell you how smart someone is.
Like Anne's story, she thought she was stupid because of bad test scores. It's important to address the stress, not just do more test prep. And stereotype threat can be a big factor. They suggest, getting in a warrior mode for tests using music, rituals, visualization. And Jeffrey's story, he was bullied, and that probably affected his scores. We have to address those underlying issues. And sometimes not wanting to do a test can be a form of protest. As parents, we have to show our support and care more about them than the score.
And then the big transition, college. The sources actually describe college as potentially brain toxic. Late nights, sleep deprivation is seen as cool, eating habits are all over the place, there's drinking, and way less supervision.
It makes you wonder, is every kid ready for that right out of high school? They're clear. College shouldn't be automatic, it's a choice. And it takes maturity and readiness. They talk about gap years, the benefits of exploring, gaining experience, and figuring yourself out. It's not just for rich kids, and it doesn't mean you won't go to college. And even though parents might worry about their kid feeling left behind, they suggest talking about alternatives early on. And start prepping for college early, like in 9th grade, by saying, hey, this needs to be earned, and talking about those life skills they'll need.
It's challenging that idea that if you're not a top student, you're somehow a failure. The sources point out that success comes from working hard at something you're good at and enjoy, and those skills aren't always the same as the skills you need to be a good student. And that Lake Wobegon thing, not every kid can be above average.
And those stories, Brian, Peter, Ben, Melody, who were successful but didn't follow the traditional path, they show that there are so many ways to live a good life. And Melody, she regretted not letting her own son take a gap year. It's about listening to our kids.
So to wrap up this deep dive, it seems like the message is that raising those self-driven, resilient kids, it's about prioritizing their well-being, their sense of control, their own motivation, not just external achievements.
Absolutely. External achievements, those are secondary to building that strong foundation inside.
You guys sent in some incredible sources for this deep dive, so many great strategies and ideas. Take some time to think about what stood out to you, what you can try, even just one or two small things.
And here's a thought. Maybe the best gift we can give isn't a path to a certain school or career, but the strength and self-awareness to navigate their own path. With confidence and joy, what does success mean for your child? How can you support that?
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.